Okay, so we got our bolt back in. I reviewed the first two parts of this video and want to clarify just a couple things. It's just the way I talk that might confuse some people. I talk about when we release our shell from our tube, comes back, and I keep saying pushes our button, which is just because that's what you can visually see. What I'm talking about is toggling that carrier lock plate, which is what our button does when we push it. It rocks that back. Our shell does the same thing when it comes out. Our shell pushes that back, which is the same thing our button does off of this little pivot pin piece right there. The other thing that I've said is in the diagnostics, when we shoot an empty shell, what I mean is our shell tube is empty. We're doing a single shot, so we're not worried about feeding on here. We're strictly working about the bolt. We got our bolt back in. Now that we know how everything works and how everything holds, we're going to try and get into how do we get the shell out and load our other shell. One thing, I'm sure I'll get this question, I haven't gotten it yet, and I'm going to do my best to try and remember to show this to you when I take it apart. When you go to put your bolt back together, if you can't get your charge handle to slide all the way back forward up into the bolt, it's this little pin right here. And let me pull that back so we can see that a little better. There's a little slot right here, and there's a little groove in that pin. So when you finally get your bolt out and you get all the muck and gunk and stuff cleaned out so that pin's nice and free, and of course we have wear on our gun, it'll fall down and it won't want to line up with that slot. So if it does, just kind of flip it around and wiggle jiggle your handle a little bit and it'll line up and it'll let that go back up in. I'll do my best to try and remember to show you that when I take the bolt and everything back out. Okay? So the one thing we want to show you on the bolt is our extractor, and I'm going to say these backwards quite a few times, so bear with me. Extractor and ejector. This is our extractor here. It's spring loaded, okay? So that lets it ride up over the shell when it comes forward into battery. All right, we want to make sure that has a nice amount of spring tension on it and it's free. The other thing is the hook that we want to look at, okay? Make sure this hook is decently sharp so it can hold. You want this to hold our shell to the bolt face and against the side of our barrel as everything comes back together, okay? The one thing I say about extractors, most automatic guns, extractors do not extract, okay? Bolt action guns, the bolt, when it comes up, the extractor actually has to pull the shell that's expanded in the barrel or the chamber and break it loose and pull it back out. Okay. On a normal automatic gun, sorry about that, our barrel's never going to move. So when we come up, load and fire our shell, the force of the pressure in the chamber is going to blow our bolt back. What's blowing our bolt back is the cartridge itself, because our shot and everything hasn't got out the end of the barrel yet. It's the pressure that makes this unlock, which we looked at the locking lug, makes it unlock and come back. Okay? Once again, we're working 100% backwards. Everything is coming back. We're locking our bolt, and then our barrel's coming forward. So in this case, that little extractor has to hold good enough to the case that it pulls it out of the barrel. Okay? The other thing it's going to do, it's going to hold our shell up against this back side of our barrel so that our ejector can grab it. And I'll see if I can get a good shot of that. There's our ejector coming right past that bolt face. Okay, so if we look down in there, you'll see it come right up the side, and right there it's going to catch the edge of that shell and it's going to flip it off the extractor. Now there's different models of this. If you look at the first video has two of those. So it holds the shell to the bolt face, which is much more positive than this is. The one thing with that we'll have to look at is when that comes up, it needs to pull the shell off of that inside extractor so it can pivot off of that outside extractor and come out the hole. Okay, so one of the issues with that is if this gets over sharpened or has too much hold on it, it'll just hold the shell to the bolt face and the ejector will just ride right past it. The other thing I want to point out is the clicking that you hear. We talked earlier about dispensing a shell out of our tube is our fingers here, and we saw the two little levers that move that. When you hear that click right there, that's us dropping a shell. So the timing on this is you have to have our ejector hitting the shell and pivoting it on the extractor when we let that other shell come out onto the shell carrier. Because when we let that shell hit that shell carrier and toggle our little latch that our button pushes, we're going to let all this go and it's going to come forward. So we have to have that shell almost all the way out of our ejection port before that releases it. And that's where we get into the little ring that we were talking about earlier. If this move does all that too fast, then we don't have enough time for it to clear and get out of the hole. Okay? So if we look at that with a shell, got to empty here. Okay. All right. So we got our round chambered. We're ready to go. We fire. Our bolt comes back. It locks our bolt handle. Our bolt face comes forward a little bit. And there's that ejector holding that case. Okay? As soon as we come up to where there's our as we open it up, there's our extractor holding the case, waiting for our ejector to hit it and spit it out. And it whips it out the side. Okay? So on this gun right now, everything looks like it's working beautifully. If you do that on the bench and it doesn't come all the way out, now granted this is very light because it doesn't have any shot or anything in it, so it's easier for it to get it out of there. But this should work all the way around. Okay? If you're having ejection problems of your shell, one of the things you can do, shoot your gun that way. Okay? Pointing down. Shoot your gun pointing up. Shoot your gun kind of towards the ground, but be careful you don't, make sure you know where your shot's going. But one of the things that'll help you, if it's weak and it doesn't quite have enough kick, it'll work a lot better this way than it will this way. And it should work 360 degrees, pointing up, pointing down, birds, whatever you're shooting at. It should do the same thing every time it goes. Okay. So we'll take a closer look at the ejector here. The ejector on this is a single point. Okay, one of the things that we want to look at is how sharp is this little edge, because this is the edge that's going to grab our shell when it goes by. Right? Oftentimes these get rounded. It should be positive, so that the front of your hook should be pointing this way. As it wears, it gets more neutral and more neutral, and sooner or later it just won't have enough bite on the shell, because instead of biting the edge of the shell, it's just hitting it like a flat wall. Okay, and a lot of times with these that have only the single extractor, it'll come up and hit that, and it'll push your extractor out of the way and just go right on by your shell, and then everything just flop it in your chamber. Which is the other thing we're going to look at when we do this, is where is this shell when everything's all said and done. Okay, but mainly once we come out, the only thing we want to make sure our ejector is going to hold that flat against the barrel. We're going to come all the way back until our ejector hits that. Our extractor needs to still be holding it because that's our pivot point, and we're going to kick it right on up out of the shell. Alright. We'll put this back together one more time. Now originally, the ejector on this one is soldered in. Okay, it's a one piece. If you look at the other video that I had, which is a newer model, there's actually two little fingers that have a gap in the middle of them, and it's riveted in with two rivets. Those are a lot easier. You just knock the rivets out and put those in. On these, I generally try and see what I can do to work this, get this a little sharper. If it's not all the way against the bolt face, you want to get that kind of tapped in a little bit if you can. You got to be careful because it'll break really easy, and it doesn't really want to move. And if you knock it too loose, it's just going to fall out after you shoot about 40 or 50 rounds. So, but one thing we do want to look at and see is how close it is when we come up out of there. Now this one I always, excuse me, this one I already worked it a little bit. So when it comes up, you can see it's right there on the edge of that bolt. Okay, so if you have too much clearance there, you're not catching enough of the shell, and you won't have enough kick. And what you'll get on that is this. So if everything's working properly, and we load one single shell in the chamber, we don't put anything in our tube, and this is what we're getting. We're not holding it good enough with the ejector. We're not hitting it hard enough. We're not holding it with the extractor. We're not hitting it hard enough with the ejector, or we don't have enough ejector engagement, or we're just going too fast. We're not giving it enough time for this to get out before we let go of our bolt. So, and I apologize, I said that backwards. If we shoot it without a secondary round, it should kick that out just fine. And our bolt should stay in the back position as we discussed before. So if it's not, and it's just laying floppy in there when you're done, you still got it in there, you're not hitting anything, you're not holding anything. When we put our second shell in there, and we chamber this one, we load another one. If we end up with this, then we know that we're either too fast and we're not giving it enough time to get out, or we're not holding it tight enough on our pivot, or hitting it hard enough on our injector. The other thing in this scenario, if we're running too fast, we'll have our other shell either still in this tube or sitting right underneath the other one. And this is the hardest thing to figure out, because if we start shoving our shell up in there before we get this one kicked out, we're going to have two bound in there, and it's not going to let this come out far enough. You're going to end up with it wedged, kind of like that, and the bolt's not going to come fully forward. It's just going to smash it, or it's going to rechamber that one, and it'll rechamber that one, and your other one will still be sitting underneath it. So if you grab the barrel and you pull the barrel back and slam the barrel forward, the other one will probably knock this one up far enough it'll come out. Okay, so those are our important points on this. Just make sure that we're holding this tight against the side. If we got doubles, we want to make sure that we're not holding it so tight that the ejector is going right on by our shell, and we want to make sure that we have good clearance on that. But the timing on this is critical. If you start grinding and filing and cutting on stuff, you want to make sure that when you hear that click, your ejector better be hitting that shell. If it isn't, you're never going to, you can do whatever you want, you can do whatever you want. Your timing is just so far off that you need more meat on that ejector so that it's hitting it and starting to kick it before we tell everything, go ahead, load a shell, and come out the end. Okay? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pull this apart real quick. Take the trigger out would help, huh? This is the pin I was talking about a minute ago. It'll tend to kind of tuck in there like that. Handle. When your handle goes up in, this groove of your handle rides past that little pin. Okay? So if you go to put it together and it won't go forward, it's because it's catching on that pin if it's too far in. It'll start, but it won't go all the way past.